When you hear the word character stories, what pops into your mind? Well, that's supposed to be character, as in the person who's on the front cover or the person whose constellation the story quest is the name of. But I think we've all heard of at least one criticism regarding Genshin's way of writing characters and characters' story quests. And it usually boils down to NPC gets a spotlight, character gets sidelined, or character dating simulator, which aren't completely true for all the characters' story quests, but a lot of them tend to revolve around us fixing an NPC's problems with the help of a character, or we learn more about an NPC and their history with the character just being an instrument. Which is really weird if you think about it. But that's not completely true. But today, I want to actually investigate the criticism because in a gacha game, you never want your character writing to flop. Now disclaimer, this is all just my subjective opinion and critique of Genshin's character story state. You can absolutely just be fine with how Genshin does its character stories, and that's okay. My critiques don't have to be your critiques either, and such is the state of life. But if you're watching this far into the video, then you're probably curious what my takes are, so first, some important thoughts and providing a much deeper contextualization as to why character story quests are the way that they are. Number 1 is that Genshin characters are products. Genshin characters, whether we like it or not, have this unique position of being products compared to other fictional characters. Now, that's not completely a bad thing, but if you just compare how NPCs are written versus how Genshin playable characters are written, you can definitely see the disparity. We need to understand that we're in a gacha game, with a community that really despises flawed characters no matter how much we try to say that we have an open mind. Anyway, Genshin characters are usually idealistic caricatures of the best parts of humanity. Their confidence, their charisma, their intelligence, their ability to fight against circumstance. And that's because Genshin's playable characters are usually made with the mind of selling. And unfortunately, this bleeds into the representation and creates a pseudo safety net and strict criteria of characterization. There's almost this mentality that no one's going to buy a character that farts or a character that lies, a character that cheats, which is weird, and I don't understand why. Genshin's character writing is almost like you can have the flaws, but they're either going to be really cute and memeable, or they're accidentally going to be your biggest asset and they're not actually going to harm you or give you any negative consequences. Ugh. Number 2 is that character story quests are usually made to be multi-chaptered. We also need to understand the sample size we have of story quests aren't completely consistent in quality even against each other. Character story quests are meant to be multifaceted, and the first character story is usually much more shallow. But there's a problem with this. An example would be with Kazuha. When Kazuha's first character story came out, we technically had more instances of meeting him already. 1.6, 2.0, 2.1, 2.2, and 2.6, which should allow a deeper kind of story format for his character story because this isn't the first time that we connected with him and his insecurities. And that was the case for his 2.8 domain being a deeper look into his ideologies as a character and his history with the Kaidaharas. But his character story, the permanent interpretation of his character, doesn't have that level of nuance and instead focuses on his external attitudes and helping this mysterious cursed sword. Thus, a lot of people saying that yes, this became an NPC simulator with the sword getting almost all of the character development. Anyway, so the argument that the character stories are only on part 1 can easily fall apart because 1, we have events where we grow a closer relationship with them, with the exception of new characters that are released alongside their character story quests. 2 is that there's no guarantee that all characters would even get a part 2 to their story quests. And number 3 is that the problems with story quests can be a blanket phenomenon in most of them, not just isolated to one character. Now, number 3 is that Genshin characters aren't usually made to develop. This is going to be a weird take, but I need to establish this. Genshin characters aren't usually made to develop. Well, 90% of the time they are not. When the traveler meets a character, they've already gone through their traumatic backstory or crippling character development that shaped and defined their moralities. A lot of the characters we actually meet are already people who have gone through their problems, have come to terms with their situation, and are at inner peace within themselves. This is why most of the heart-wrenching character changes and flaws are in the character profiles, not the in-game story quests. This is with a few exceptions, of course, but the rule of thumb is generally A playable character's personality and their core are already established and secure prior to their meeting of the Traveler, because they already went through their character development off-screen. For example, in lore, Venti and Zhongli went through a lot of change in the Archon War, and the character we see now is just a byproduct of years of coping, grief, and sadness. This could very well be the best versions of themselves because they've already achieved a form of internal peace. But unfortunately, we will most likely never see that development in-game. It'll take so much more and so much harder situations for Venti and Zhongli's characterization to actually move. We will never see that side of Hu Tao who lost her grandfather, the side of Tartaglia who had to go through the traumas of the Abyss, or the side of Yaimiko who lost the Kitsune Saigyu and most of her yokai companions, or the side of Ayato who had to work diligently to regain the honor of the Kamisatos. Now, this sounds really fine on paper because this means we're seeing people who have come to terms with their problems, but this poses several problems when executed too much and too consistently. Character movement is oftentimes defined by their character development and growth on screen. The very popular term for this is that you can't improve upon perfection. Genshin actually plays a lot of things safe and rarely shows their characters in the disadvantageous positions. This is actually why a lot of people say that the characters in Genshin feel like stereotypical archetypes, which I don't really fault them for. The character lore is extensive, but because there's hardly any movement of themselves on screen, they can feel horribly static. And last but not the least is that the character development is mostly external, not internal. Genshin character stories usually have NPCs to be included as external problems that need to be solved with the help of the dedicated character's knowledge, presence, and experience. For example, the Commission Crisis with Ayato needed his tactical wit and patience. Star Snatcher needed Xiao's strict guidance to stop him from deluding himself. The Cursed Sword needed Kazuha's patience and firmness to guide it to the right mindset. The character is usually there to be the problem solver, which is what makes the character story quests feel more like dates in an NPC simulator. Now, if you combine all these mini problems together, these character stories start feeling less about themselves. Did you notice that almost all of the cool parts of being a character are given to the NPCs? Now, what do we do with the character story quests to quote-unquote improve them? I can think of several, but these aren't end-all be-all, and I'm actually curious what you guys think in the comments. Number 1 is increase internal problems. Internal problems are related to the point that I said about the lack of internal development. They're what I like to define as the character's own insecurities and uncertainties that they're not quite sure of themselves and have to work on in the future. We return to Genshin's characters as being products, and this is where I actually opened the term Mary Sue and Gary Sue. These characters are often defined as characters with perfect personalities whose flaws aren't actually regarded by the story as detrimental to themselves and to others. Oftentimes just smaller quirks that are funny or cute, but they never get the repercussions of their actions displayed in the current story. And a lot of Genshin's characters are actually like this. They're oftentimes portrayed as the solid paragons with little to no questioning of their ideals, whose flaws are just played out for jokes without really having wild stakes that could affect the world around them. This isn't consistent to every character, of course, but again, most of the characters are written like this. They always come out on top of their problems, and they're almost always one step above their opponents, whether or not they deserve the lead in the first place. I'm looking at that one time that Kokomi descended upon the earth like Jesus. So I believe that if Genshin wants to spice up the character's story quests and drive it further home, show the characters making mistakes. Show them upset, angry, furious, sad at themselves, or show them with vulnerabilities. Show us moments of a character's lowest points so that their highest points shine the brightest. I actually think that Genshin's event in 2.8 is absolutely stellar in terms of developing their 4 main characters further, and even showing Fischl developing herself. Another moment of vulnerability that I really appreciated was the quiet after Tartaglia's fight with the Ruin Guards. The Foul Legacy and his delusion were seen as massively powerful abilities, and Tartaglia himself is a hardened prodigy. But to see him on the verge of exhaustion and almost death shows us a different side of him. Venti's quiet moments after Stanley showed us that Venti was quite frightened by the Traveler's intuition, and it's that quiet side of uncertainty in a character's development that the audience usually attaches quest too. Even if that story quest is super NPC focused, and can I just say that if we cut out that last section, this story quest wouldn't be as loved. A's character story quest is loved because it left a great impact on the player base. We have a character that's previously portrayed as this paragon of perfection, slowly cracking her mind and losing it. But this can also be a double-edged sword. A character's flaws need to be supplemented with sizable accomplishments. It's a give and take balance that creates good character. And on the topic of internal development, make the stakes more personal. I think Tartalia's and Zhongli's story quest part 2 do this point really well because they're actually attached to the NPCs that are featured alongside them, Tuser and Kunjun. When I say make the stakes more personal, I mean that the problems of the story quest actually directly affect the featured character, and aren't just parallels of the characters' stories. A lot of the times, the stakes in character stories are usually the NPCs going through something that's vaguely related to the themes of the character. Stanley with Venti, Star Snatcher with Xiao, the Leo Chising with the Yelan, and the Demons with Yaimiko are good examples of that. But it's never usually a problem that's from the characters themselves. In character story quests, I'm confident in saying that we hardly have moments where the characters feel truly connected to the stakes of the problem, because it's the NPCs who usually lose something if the quest isn't resolved. The characters usually just help out of obligation or personal "I want to help" attitudes, which can sometimes be pretty shallow. This is actually why I really like Ayaka's story quest, where she had to learn the secrets of her mother. So all in all, to actually drive home the point, there needs to be a stronger personal reason for the character to actually be there, and for them to actually care for this quest to be resolved rather than just obligation. Number 3 is stop putting the character developments in events. Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate here and say this. On paper, it's actually really difficult for Genshin to put the level of interactions we've seen in limited event quests onto one character's story. The reason why event quests are as vast and as loved as they are is that they don't focus on one character all too much, and instead a full ensemble. Anyways, it's actually really difficult to narratively translate the current event quests into story quests, but not impossible. In my opinion, 1.1 were very good stories that fleshed out Mona and Fischl, a friendship that would be consistent until 2.8. 1.2 and 2.3 could easily just be Albedo's character story quests part 2 and 3, and they should have been because those moments revealed a lot of crucial elements of Albedo's story that would definitely be required in the future if he reappears in a permanent story quest. 2.8's domain can actually be their own character stories, and rightfully so. I would have very much preferred Kazuha's domain to be his actual story quest because it revealed more about Kazuha's past and problems. The history of the Kaidehara family from Kazuha's immediate recognition is such an important factor into why he wanted to become a wanderer in the first place. Same goes for the other 3. Also, we got robbed of really cool-looking domains being permanent content anyway. The problem with character development being hidden in events is that not only do new players lose out on the experience of getting to know the character more, it also reduces the character. If you just consumed the 1.3 story quest, you would think Xiao is just a quiet, brooding figure with a lot of baggage. And while he is, the newer Lantern Rite events show that he's genuinely trying to connect with old friends and new people, just that he's having a hard time. Your version of a character, especially if you're a new player that's only consuming the permanent content, is different from how an old player would perceive them. The character's story quests just don't have this level of depth. So in conclusion, I want to end this video with a much more positive note because I really do believe that Genshin can pull off great and fascinating story quests that challenge the artificial status quo they've created for themselves. Albedo's story quest had no external NPC to guide and instead became a conversation between the traveler and him. A's story quest part 2 was detrimental to understanding her gripes and fear as a character and thus solidifying her ideals of eternity, but in a healthier approach. And there are so many more story quests that I think have been pretty good, but there is still a wide gap that needs to be addressed. But honestly, I don't think Genshin ever will. Whether we like it or not, character story quests are made to be a promotional market, or at least the first chapter. They're meant to be a more shallow interpretation of the traveler and the character's relationship. And they're also meant to raise the character on a pillar so that they're quote-unquote cooler. I also have to remind you that most of the time, the character's story quest is released alongside of the character themselves. So playing devil's advocate, I can definitely see why a character wouldn't just completely show all of their flaws and mistakes the first time, especially if this is their first impression of them. They're meant to be products, and the moment we forget about that part in Genshin's context, then we'll just be left horribly disappointed. It would be naive not to see that character depth and development aren't usually the priorities, especially not when it's the first chapter, and especially not in a game where the characters are meant to represent ideologies. Just because it's meant to be a certain way doesn't mean it shouldn't be scrutinized. Genshin has played it a little too safe when it comes to things. Character development is disproportional between the characters, but it's not completely absent, which is why I hope that Genshin could realize that character story quests are meant for the character to internalize their emotions and develop, or maybe we see more of their insecurities and flaws that make them human. We can see a character training themselves instead of training an NPC, the character themselves having a problem instead of someone asking for help. All in all, I just want to say, if Genshin wants to make better character story quests, they need to make the characters more vulnerable. Keyword, want. Anyway, my name is Aster and thank you for chilling with me.